Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into a case today that it takes us back to the early 90s to Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah.
And, Phoenix, it's known for its sunshine, right? It's got those beautiful desert landscapes.
Yeah, the iconic canals.
Right, exactly. The canals, they're kind of like the veins of this city. They bring life to the desert.
It's almost ironic, though, because in
Uh-huh.
this case, those canals, they become the backdrop for something really sinister.
Yeah, that's what we're going to dig into today. We've
Oh.
got news articles, court records, forensic analysis, and they all paint a picture of a city that's dealing with a pretty horrifying reality.
Mm.
These canals, these places people go for recreation, they become, well, hunting grounds.
Places of fear.
And at the heart of it all, there are two young women, Angela Braso, she was 22, worked in tech, and Melanie Bernice, only 17, still in high school.
Both found murdered near the canals about a year apart. And the details, well, they're pretty disturbing.
Definitely not a lighthearted story today. So Angela's case, it starts in November 1992. She was last seen going for a bike ride along the canal. Imagine, her boyfriend's at home making her a birthday cake.
Wow, that's awful. Just an ordinary evening, right? Turns into a tragedy.
And it was the next morning the searchers found her near the canal. But, and this is the hard part, her body was dismembered.
Yeah, and her head, it was kept separate, like a trophy almost.
Exactly. It's that kind of detail, just sent chills through the whole city. It wasn't just a murder. It felt planned, almost ritualistic.
And that term ritualistic, it has a specific meaning in criminal profiling. It suggests the killer gets a psychological satisfaction from the way it's done. It goes beyond the act of killing.
So you have a killer on the loose, potentially one with, I don't know, really dark motivations. And then almost a year later, just as Phoenix is starting to cope with Angela's murder, it happens again.
This time, it's Melanie Bernice. Her mom was out for the evening, and Melanie, she decides to go for a bike ride along the canal.
Another bike ride.
Yeah, and it was actually another cyclist who found her. There was a blood trail leading to Melanie's body, which was submerged in the water.
So two young women, both cyclists, both found near the canals. That's a pattern that's hard to ignore, right? And the fact that these canals were such a popular place for people to go, it just amplified the fear, I think.
Definitely. Imagine these paths, they were a place to relax, to get away, and now they're associated with death. It changes how people see the whole city. It's a loss of that feeling of safety.
For sure. So what happened with the investigation? Did they find any leads?
Well, they went all out. They interviewed over 600 people, spent hours and hours analyzing evidence. But, despite all that effort, the case just went cold for years.
A mystery with no answers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where things get interesting. Years later, technology catches up and DNA analysis, well, it opens up a whole new chapter in this case. And the suspect, well, let's just say you won't see this one coming.
Okay, now I'm even more curious. We're going to get into all of this. But first, let's take a step back. How did these murders change Phoenix? It wasn't just about catching the killer, right? It was about a community trying to heal, trying to feel safe again.
Right. They had to figure out how to reclaim these public spaces, these canals that had become a symbol of fear. And that's actually a pretty inspiring part of this story.
Okay, so before we get to the big break in the case, let's talk about that. How did Phoenix respond?
Well, people didn't just hide away. They actually came together, made changes. It was about taking back those spaces and making sure that Angela and Melanie, well, their deaths weren't in vain.
So they took action. What kinds of things did they actually do?
Well, people just became a lot more aware, like more cautious when they were using the canal paths.
Yeah.
Especially at night. They might not go alone or just, pay more attention to what was going on around them.
Right, like be aware of your surroundings.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about individuals being more careful, right? The city itself actually made changes to the canals to make them safer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They put in more lights along the paths and those emergency call boxes, like, the ones you see on college campuses and stuff. They put those in along the canals.
Smart.
Yeah, more police patrols, too, especially when there were more people out using the paths. And they had those public awareness campaigns, like reminding people to report anything suspicious and to just be more aware of their safety.
So they were tackling it from a lot of different angles.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't just reacting to the fear. It was about actually trying to prevent anything like this from happening again.
It sounds like almost a community effort. It's
Yep.
interesting how something so tragic can actually bring people together, like galvanize them into action.
Yeah, totally. It shows how resilient people can be. But, while all this was happening, the case was still unsolved. For years, those murders just hung over the city.
Like an open wound.
Right. This big question mark. And then years later, that's when the DNA technology really comes into play. That's when they got that breakthrough.
That's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. You got to remember, back then, DNA technology was pretty new. It wasn't like it is now, where they can get DNA from, like, the tiniest piece of evidence.
Right, so they went back and looked at the old evidence with these new techniques, hoping they could find something new.
Exactly. And it worked. This technique called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, it let them take tiny little bits of DNA and make copies of them.
Copies.
Yeah, so they'd have enough to actually analyze it, you know? Samples that were too small back then, they could work with them now.
Okay, so they have this new DNA evidence.
Yeah.
But how does that lead them to a suspect after all this time?
Well, they put it into this national database, CODIS. It's where law enforcement can compare DNA from crime scenes to DNA from convicted criminals. And in 2003, they got a hit.
A match.
Yeah.
After all that time. This is where it gets really interesting. Who was it?
The DNA matched a guy named Brian Patrick Miller. And here's the thing, he wasn't some, like, shady character or anything. He seemed totally normal.
He was just living in Phoenix the whole time.
Yeah, and get this, he was known in town as the zombie hunter.
The zombie hunter.
Yeah, he drove this car that looked like a hearse, and he'd dress up like a zombie hunter for parades and stuff.
Wow, okay, now this is a twist. So we go from a city that's terrified to a cold case, to a DNA breakthrough, and now the main suspect is this zombie hunter.
It really shows you how appearances can be deceiving, huh?
Totally. So they had this DNA match,
Right.
and this guy who seemed to be living a double life. What did they do next?
Well, they started looking into his past, trying to find any link to the victims or the crime scenes, talk to people who knew him, just tried to build a picture of him, you know, his life, his behavior, all that.
Did they find anything besides the DNA that showed he might be guilty?
They did, actually. When they started digging, they noticed some weird stuff. People talked about how he acted strange sometimes, said creepy things.
Huh.
Yeah, and he did things that made it seem like he was really into violence and death.
So the zombie hunter thing, maybe it wasn't just a fun persona.
Maybe. And then they found even more evidence, stuff in his house that linked him right to the crime scenes. Like, there was a knife that matched the wounds on Angela Brasso's body.
So the DNA was just the start. It led to all this other evidence.
Right. And in 2015, almost 20 years after the murders, Brian Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter, he was arrested and charged with the murders of Angela Braso and Melanie Bernice.
It's just wild to think, he had this whole normal life, the zombie hunter act. And meanwhile, he was capable of doing these horrible things. Makes you wonder, like, did anybody see any signs? Did they miss anything?
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, looking back, you often see those red flags, little things, behaviors. That seems strange, but nobody thought too much about them at the time.
Right. Right. It's like one of those pictures where you see one thing and then suddenly you see something completely different.
Exactly. And with Miller, after he was arrested, people did start remembering things like, oh, yeah, he said this weird thing once, or he acted kind of creepy that time. But back then, nobody really connected the dots.
It's scary to think that some of the most dangerous people, they're the ones who blend in, who seem normal.
Yeah. It's a good reminder to trust your gut. If something feels off about somebody, even if you think you're overreacting, it's probably worth paying attention to.
So, okay, they arrested him. What happened next? Did he go to trial?
Oh, yeah. It was a long trial, really complicated. The prosecution had all this evidence, the DNA, the stuff they found at his place, people talking about his weird behavior.
And his offense, what did they say?
They tried to say the DNA wasn't reliable and that the other evidence was just circumstantial. They said he was just a weird guy, not a murderer.
But the jury didn't believe that.
Nope. They found him guilty of both murders. And he ended up getting the death penalty. So, after all those years, there was finally some justice for Angela and Melanie's families.
It's amazing, really, that they were able to solve it after so long. It really shows you how much technology has changed things and that they never gave up on finding the truth. But even with the case closed, it still leaves you with some questions.
Yeah, for sure. Like, how did he manage to hide who he really was for so long? Were there other things people missed? And, bigger questions about how someone can do something like that.
And what about Phoenix? I mean, did the city ever really get over what happened? Did they start feeling safe again around the canals?
That's a tough one. I think those murders definitely changed things. It's like a shadow hanging over the city. But I also think people were determined to move on, to not let fear control their lives.
So a mix of healing and still being cautious.
Right. I think this whole story, it's got lessons for everybody. Be aware, trust your instincts, and remember that danger can be lurking anywhere, even when you least expect it.
It's a heavy thought, but an important one. And as we wrap things up here, I keep thinking about Angela and Melanie. Their lives were cut way too short, but their stories have really stayed with people.
They have. It makes you realize how precious life is and how important it is to fight for justice, even when it seems impossible. Their memories, they're still pushing people to make things better, to prevent tragedies like this from happening again.
And maybe that's the main takeaway from all of this. Never forget, never give up, and always keep striving for a better, safer world.
Well said, and that's a good place to leave it, I think. Thanks for listening, everybody.